January 1944. A cold wind sweeps across the barren landscape of a North African prisoner of war camp, the dust kicking up as a convoy of American military trucks rumbles into view. For the men standing in the dusty, sun-drenched dirt, this is yet another bleak moment in a seemingly endless war. They are Italian soldiers, captured in the brutal campaigns of the Mediterranean. Their uniforms are frayed, their faces worn with exhaustion and fear. Each man carries the weight of defeat, of uncertainty. Some have lost their comrades, some have lost their will to fight, but all of them are caught in the same limbo, far from home, under the indifferent glare of the Sunday. Then, something shifts. The sound of distant gunfire, once a reminder of the war that still rages beyond these walls, fades into silence. The men stand motionless, waiting, unsure of what to expect. Suddenly, American soldiers approach, their uniforms unfamiliar, but their faces more compassionate than any of the prisoners have seen in years. One soldier offers water, another speaks in broken Italian, his voice calm, reassuring. And then, as the realization settles over them, this is not another enemy. This is a chance, a glimpse of safety. Tears begin to fall from the eyes of one man. His hand trembles as he reaches for the water. It's not just the water, it's the dawning understanding that the war, the endless nightmare, is over. They are safe. The camera lingers on the emotional release. A man who had fought with desperation now stands in the shadow of compassion. His shoulders shake with sobs. This moment marks the end of fear and the beginning of something far more uncertain, but for now, it is enough. The year 1943 marked a dramatic turning point in the Second World War. Italy, once a formidable ally of Nazi Germany, found itself caught in a spiral of defeat. The Italian military, already stretched thin and demoralized by years of warfare, had suffered significant losses in North Africa, where they faced the relentless pressure of the British Eighth Army and the newly arrived American forces. Italy's participation in the war had been an uphill struggle since its entry in 1940, and by 1943, the reality of surrender loomed large. In the summer of that year, Italy's situation was desperate. Following the devastating defeat at the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, Italian forces retreated into Tunisia, where they would face the full might of the advancing Allies. The situation was dire. Their once proud armies had been shattered, their supply lines cut, and their morale completely broken. Yet it was not just the military defeats that defined this moment. It was the growing disillusionment with Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. On the 25th of July 1943, Mussolini was deposed in a coup, and King Victor Emmanuel III assumed control of the government, signaling a shift in Italy's war aims. A few days after Mussolini's ousting, the new Italian government began secret negotiations with the Allies. On the 8th of September 1943, Italy officially surrendered to the Allies, marking the end of the country's participation in the Axis powers. But the surrender unleashed chaos. The Germans quickly moved to seize control of northern Italy, and the Italian military, now divided, had to choose sides. Many soldiers found themselves in the impossible position of having fought for Mussolini's regime, only to find their nation in disarray. Some chose to continue fighting for the Germans, while others, disillusioned and confused, laid down their arms or surrendered to the Allies. The American military, having fought alongside the British forces in North Africa and Italy, now faced an influx of Italian prisoners of war. These men, who had once been the enemies of the Allies, were now caught in the crossfire of their nation's collapse. Thousands of Italian soldiers were captured, their fates uncertain. The Americans, who had established a policy of humane treatment for prisoners, were faced with the difficult task of managing a new population of POWs, not all of whom had volunteered to fight in the war. As the prisoners were transported from the front lines to POW camps, the uncertainty they faced only deepened. Their new captors, the Americans, were strangers to them, a foreign force, unknown, distant. For many of these men, The thought of American captivity was no less terrifying than the brutality of the Axis forces. Yet it would not be long before they realized that their fate in American hands was far different from what they had imagined. As the Italian surrender took hold, the United States found itself in a unique position. The rapid advances in Italy, from the Allied invasion of Sicily to the relentless push up the Italian peninsula, had brought with them an influx of prisoners, and among them many Italians. The task of managing these prisoners fell primarily on the United States, who, despite being a relatively young military power compared to their British and German counterparts, had developed a policy of humane treatment for prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions, which outlined the treatment of prisoners, had been adopted by most major nations. However, it was the United States, in particular, that sought to differentiate itself by adhering to these conventions more strictly than some of its wartime allies. For American soldiers, the idea of treating prisoners with dignity was not only a matter of moral principle, but also a strategic one. By demonstrating respect and care for POWs, the U.S. hoped to foster goodwill, prevent the radicalization of enemy soldiers, and perhaps even encourage defections from the Axis ranks. The Italians, now captives in their own right, had few resources or options. Their uniforms were ragged, their food supplies dwindling, and many were in poor health. They were sent to POW camps across North Africa, Europe, and, in many cases, to the United States. These men, though once the enemy, were now viewed through a different lens, not as soldiers of the Axis, but as individuals caught in the chaotic tides of war. While the capture of Italian soldiers was widespread, the transfer of POWs to the United States itself was an enormous logistical operation. The vast majority of the prisoners who were sent to American soil came from the campaigns in North Africa and Italy, often after long months of captivity under Axis or Allied control. The United States was not alone in this undertaking. British, Canadian, and Australian forces were also involved in the transportation and management of Italian POWs. The Allies, faced with large numbers of prisoners, made use of a sophisticated system that allowed for the relocation of these men to camps on American soil, far removed from the front lines and, for many, the horrors of the war. Upon arriving in the United States, these Italian prisoners were taken to a network of camps scattered across the country. Many were sent to remote locations, far from urban centers, where they could be more easily controlled and kept away from the public eye. The camps themselves were modest, often hastily constructed, but compared to the conditions that many had endured in Italy and North Africa, they were a welcome relief. Yet, despite the improved conditions, the transition was not without its challenges. For the Italian soldiers, their new captors were a mystery. To many, the Americans were just another group of strangers whose language they did not understand and whose motivations seemed unclear. Some prisoners struggled to accept the fact that they were no longer fighting for the fascist cause. They had been soldiers proud, disciplined, and obedient. Now, they were captives, uncertain of their place in the world. But as time passed, a shift began to take place. The Americans, who had initially been seen as just another part of the war machine, began to take on a different role. The more the prisoners interacted with their captors, the more they began to understand that the Americans were not like their previous enemies. The American treatment of POWs was characterized by an efficiency, a fairness, and a sense of respect that many of the Italians had never experienced before. For the first time in years, the Italian prisoners began to feel something they had long since abandoned hope. The war, for many, was not over, but it was no longer a threat. They were no longer enemies, they were survivors. The capture of Italian POWs by the United States was more than a mere military operation. It was an emotional turning point for the men involved. For the Italian soldiers, many of whom had been thrust into the war by Mussolini's fascist regime, captivity was a crushing blow. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were conscripts, forced into the front lines by their government, with little say in the course of their own fate. As the war dragged on, the majority of these men had become increasingly disillusioned, questioning the motives behind their involvement and the sacrifices they had been forced to make. When they were taken prisoner by the Allies, the Italians found themselves in a strange, ambiguous position. They were no longer combatants, but neither were they free. Their entire worldview had been shattered. It was in these moments of vulnerability that the true human toll of the war became clear. Prisoners who had once fought fiercely for their country were now just men, bound by fear, hunger, and exhaustion. But then, as the American soldiers began interacting with them, something remarkable happened. It wasn't just the food, the water, or the relative safety of the POW camps. It was the recognition, even in those early days, that they were not being treated as mere enemies, but as human beings. Many of these prisoners, who had lived for so long in the shadow of war and violence, began to weep, not just for the loss of comrades, but for the chance to live again. The sight of these hardened soldiers shedding tears in the face of kindness was a stark reminder of the emotional cost of war. For the Americans, this moment represented an entirely different kind of victory. They were not simply capturing soldiers, they were offering something more profound. The soldiers who had once been enemies now became a symbol of the fragility of life and the unspoken bond between captor and captive, forged not through violence, but through compassion. From a purely tactical perspective, the capture and treatment of Italian POWs during World War II was a complex operation, both logistically and strategically. The United States military, by 1943, was already experienced in handling large numbers of prisoners, but the influx of Italian soldiers required significant adjustments to the system. First, there was the matter of transportation. POWs captured in North Africa and Italy had to be moved across vast distances, often by ship, and then by rail, to various internment camps across the United States. The logistical challenges were immense. The conditions aboard the ships were difficult, but nothing compared to the journey many of the prisoners had experienced before. The journey to America was a grim reminder of the hardships these men had faced in the war, but it also marked the beginning of a transition. Upon arrival, the POWs were distributed across camps in remote areas of the United States. These camps were initially built to house the German prisoners of war, but with the influx of Italians, new facilities were hastily constructed. The camps were designed to keep prisoners secure, but the American approach was pragmatic. They understood the importance of keeping the POWs busy and productive, so many of them were put to work on farms, in factories, and on public works projects. In this way, the tactical approach to the treatment of POWs had a dual purpose. The prisoners were not only kept under control, but were also contributing to the war effort in a non-combatant role. They helped harvest crops, built roads and infrastructure, and worked in essential industries that supported the war effort. While this arrangement was practical, it also contributed to a shift in the relationship between captor and captive. The Italian POWs began to realize that, despite their circumstances, they were being treated with a level of respect and consideration that was in stark contrast to the brutal treatment they had often experienced at the hands of Axis powers. In the mid-20th century, the treatment of prisoners of war was still a rudimentary process by today's standards. However, the United States, with its vast resources and industrial capabilities, used emerging technologies to improve the management and welfare of its POWs. The transportation of prisoners across the Atlantic was made possible by the development of efficient and relatively safe transport ships. The process of moving thousands of prisoners was a logistical nightmare, but American military planners relied on detailed planning and coordination to execute it. Upon arrival in the United States, POWs were often subjected to basic medical examinations, and, depending on their condition, they were either placed in camps or sent to medical facilities. While the technology used in managing prisoners was not groundbreaking, it was more advanced than that employed by the Axis powers, particularly in terms of hygiene and healthcare. The Americans understood the importance of keeping their prisoners healthy to ensure they were capable of working, which further reflected the shift in the attitude toward POWs. More importantly, the U.S. used emerging technologies for communication with prisoners. The use of radios, although strictly controlled, allowed the POWs to receive information about the progress of the war, and letters from home were delivered regularly. These small gestures of communication helped maintain morale among Perotes, the Italian prisoners, and gave them a sense of connection to the outside world. The treatment of Italian POWs was also shaped by the leadership of both Italy and the United States. For the Italian soldiers, their fate was largely determined by the decisions of their superiors. Many of these men had little control over the war's outcome and were caught in the midst of political changes that had left them vulnerable. With Mussolini's fall from power, Italy's military leadership was in disarray. The Italian soldiers found themselves fighting in a war they did not believe in, and for many, the decision to surrender or switch sides was one of survival. On the American side, leadership was defined by a commitment to the principles of humane treatment for POWs. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later become president, played a pivotal role in shaping American policies toward prisoners. He understood that how prisoners were treated would have long-term strategic and political implications. The leadership in the American military believed that by treating POWs with respect, they could sow seeds of goodwill that would help rebuild a post-war relationship with Italy. From the Italian perspective, the Americans were initially seen as just another force in the war, but over time, the prisoners began to recognize a significant difference in how they were treated. While the Germans and the fascist Italian forces had enforced harsh discipline and cruelty, the Americans seemed distant yet, in comparison, almost compassionate. The idea that their captors were enemies at first seemed impossible to reconcile with the kindness many POWs experienced. Their American captors spoke to them not with hatred, but with a degree of empathy and respect. In fact, some Italians began to speak of their American captors with a surprising degree of admiration. The shift in perception was gradual, but by the time the war ended, many former POWs had shed their previous notions of the term Americans as just another enemy. Instead, they began to view them as the force that had saved them from a brutal fate. As the war raged on and the world bore witness to its many horrors, one of the most profound and subtle shifts occurred in the way prisoners of war were viewed. The United States, which had fought against the fascist powers that upheld a brutal ideology of dominance and dehumanization, found itself navigating a moral dilemma when it came to handling those who had once been their enemies. But in treating Italian prisoners with dignity and respect, the U.S. military began to display a morality that was, in many ways, a stark contrast to the regimes they were fighting. The decision to offer Italian soldiers food, shelter, and the opportunity to work, rather than punish them or use them for retaliatory purposes, was not just a matter of strategy. It was an embodiment of the moral principles that were beginning to take root in the Allied military command. To view the Italian soldiers not as irredeemable enemies, but as men who had been caught in the web of their country's fascist policies, was a revolutionary shift, one that recognized their humanity, not just their status as captives. There is a deep irony in this moral approach. For many of the Italian soldiers, who had once fought for a dictator they didn't necessarily believe in, the first true taste of freedom came not from their own government or military, but from their American captors. It was a painful realization for some that the war they had fought for, the cause they had been conscripted into, had not only stripped them of their dignity, but also cost them their identities. Yet, it was in the hands of the Americans, who had once been the enemy, that they were finally treated with respect and compassion. The moral shift was not confined to the Italian POWs alone. For the American soldiers, this was an opportunity to demonstrate the contrast between their cause and that of their enemies. While the Axis powers used terror and cruelty to maintain control, the Allies sought to win the hearts and minds of the soldiers they captured. This was not merely about winning a war, but about winning peace, about showing that their victory would not be marked by revenge, but by the rebuilding of the world, brick by brick, even among the rubble of conflict. For the Italian soldiers, the psychological impact of their captivity in American hands was both profound and complex. Many of the men had joined the military out of a sense of duty to their country, but as the war dragged on, that sense of duty began to erode. By the time they were captured, most Italian soldiers were weary and disillusioned, having endured hardships on multiple fronts. In the camps, the Italians were faced with a new kind of psychological stress. They were separated from their comrades, stripped of their identity as soldiers, and forced to live in a foreign country under the care of foreign soldiers. For many, this was the first time they had been removed from the battlefields and the sense of purpose that came with being part of a larger military machine. But it also offered a strange, unexpected reprieve. There was no longer the constant threat of death on the battlefield. Instead, there was a feeling of uncertainty, of waiting. And as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, the psychological toll began to shift from fear and trauma to something akin to acceptance. Many prisoners reported experiencing a deep sense of relief after the first few weeks of captivity. While they were far from home and had no idea when they would return, the sheer absence of the relentless violence and terror of war was a balm to their battered psyches. They were no longer engaged in a fight for survival, but in a strange limbo between the horrors of war and the possibility of peace. The emotional burden they carried, the grief for fallen comrades, the regret over their actions, slowly began to lift, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Yet, the psychological scars of war were not easily erased. Many Italian POWs, after returning to their homes, found it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. The trauma of battle, coupled with the complexities of returning to a post-war society that was still in upheaval, made reintegration a difficult process. For some, the psychological toll of war would linger long after the final shot was fired. The impact of American treatment of Italian POWs extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. The legacy of how these men were treated not as faceless enemies, but as individuals who deserved care and dignity, left a lasting impression on both the prisoners and their captors. For the Italian soldiers, who were fortunate enough to be sent to the United States, many were offered opportunities to rebuild their lives after the war. Some stayed in America after their release, taking advantage of the growing post-war economy. The opportunity to work and live in a country that had once been their enemy, and to do so with a sense of security and stability, was a chance few would have dreamed of in the dark days of the war. Even for those who returned to Italy, the experience of American POW camps had a lasting effect. It changed their perception of America, and in many cases, it redefined their notions of what it meant to be an enemy. What had once been an abstract hatred became, in some cases, a deep sense of gratitude. This shift in perception would play a key role in the rebuilding of post-war relations between Italy and the United States. No longer enemies, the two nations would go on to form a strategic partnership that would help stabilize Europe in the years following the war. On a broader scale, the treatment of Italian POWs by the United States set a precedent for how prisoners were to be treated in future conflicts. The moral, psychological, and logistical approaches taken during World War II would influence how POWs were handled in the years to come. The idea that a captive soldier could be treated with dignity, even after the brutalities of war, began to take root, shaping international policies on human rights and the treatment of prisoners of war for decades to come. The moment the Italian prisoners of war realized they were safe in America's hands wasn't a single event, but a gradual, profound shift, one marked by a growing sense of disbelief, followed by tears of relief. It began in 1943, when Italy, after a series of crushing military defeats, surrendered to the Allies. The announcement, made by the new Italian government, sent shockwaves across the nation. For the soldiers, who had fought bravely, yet often without much belief in their cause, this moment of surrender was a gut-wrenching realization. They had fought alongside Nazi Germany, but now their country had capitulated to the Allies. For many Italian POWs, this moment of surrender didn't bring immediate relief. Instead, it plunged them deeper into uncertainty. The German forces, in response to the Italian surrender, quickly began to disarm Italian units and, in some cases, take them as prisoners. This brutal shift was particularly devastating for the Italian soldiers who had not chosen their fate. Captured by the Germans or the Allies, they found themselves torn between loyalty to a fallen regime and the uncertain reality of captivity. In 1944, after being taken prisoner by the Americans, the Italian soldiers were transported to the United States, far from the battlefields they had known for years. The initial transition from European POW camps to American soil was disorienting, even terrifying. These men had been raised on propaganda that painted the Americans as enemies, and their initial encounters with American soldiers were wary. But as the days passed and the reality of their captivity settled in, the true shift began. It wasn't until they arrived at the American internment camps that the Italians began to understand something profound. They were safe. The shift in treatment was immediately apparent. In contrast to the brutality of their previous captors, the Americans did not see them as enemies to be crushed, but as men to be cared for. In the camps, they were provided with adequate food, clean clothes, and medical care. For many, it was the first time in years that they had experienced such basic comforts. But it was more than that. It was the kindness of their captors, the recognition that they were being treated as human beings, not just prisoners of war. The first tangible sign of this shift came when American soldiers offered the Italian POWs their first taste of American hospitality. One by one, American troops gave them food and water, as well as the chance to bathe and rest. And then, as word spread, the Italian soldiers began to understand that this treatment would not be temporary. They were not simply being held for interrogation or punishment. They were being cared for, not as enemies, but as people. They were no longer at war, and the prospect of surviving not just the war but the bitter aftermath of destruction and fear was becoming real. One particularly poignant moment came when an American officer spoke to a group of prisoners in a makeshift shelter. He used simple Italian phrases, attempting to communicate with the men about their future, their next steps. At first, the Italians couldn't comprehend the magnitude of the officer's words, but as he spoke, the realization began to dawn. They were being offered something they had long thought impossible: peace. The tears came slowly at first, a few quiet sobs mixed with disbelief, but soon the emotions overwhelmed them. For men who had spent years living under the oppressive weight of war, captivity, and fear, the shock of their safety broke through. The sight of hardened soldiers, battle-weary and distant, allowing themselves to cry, in the face of this kindness, told a story far beyond the battlefield. The moment was not one of a single individual's revelation, but a collective understanding. The American soldiers, who had once been perceived as the enemy, were now viewed through a different lens. The image of the American soldier, not as a distant foreign force but as a symbol of relief and hope, would stay with these Italian POWs for the rest of their lives. As the weeks turned into months, the psychological transformation among the Italian prisoners deepened. No longer did they feel the sting of being labelled as mere enemies, nor did they constantly carry the heavy burden of fear. Instead, they began to experience a shift in their identity from combatants in a foreign war to individuals who had endured unimaginable hardships, now offered the possibility of survival and even a future. In the camps, the Italians were treated with a growing sense of respect. Unlike the oppressive environment they had faced under the German forces, the American captors allowed them to take part in daily activities, cooking, working, and socializing. This freedom, though modest, was a far cry from the conditions they had previously endured. At the beginning, many of the prisoners were hesitant. Having been conditioned to mistrust any forces not aligned with Mussolini's regime, they struggled to accept their newfound circumstances. But over time, they came to understand that they were not merely victims of war, nor were they an enemy to be crushed under the heel of victory. The Americans, despite their military dominance, took every step to offer a different experience than the brutality the Italians had been subjected to under fascist rule. They were no longer captives in a political struggle. They were men who had been caught in a vast global conflict, now allowed the basic rights of human dignity. The transformation wasn't limited to just physical relief. It seeped into the psychological and emotional state of the Italian POWs. Men who had once been hardened by years of combat began to soften. They spoke openly about their fears, their hopes, and their losses. In group conversations, they shared stories of their homes in Italy, of families they had not seen in years, and of the dreams they once held dear before the war. It was in these conversations that many began to see each other not as soldiers of an enemy nation, but as survivors of the same nightmare, a shared experience of loss, of sacrifice, and of resilience. The bonds between the Italian POWs and their American captors grew stronger over time. It was not just the Americans' care for them that had an impact, but the realization that they were being treated with a level of respect and humanity not extended by other powers in the conflict. Slowly, the Italians began to view their captors not as invaders, but as protectors. For many, this redefined their concept of enemy and ally. One particularly telling moment of this shift occurred in late 1944, when a group of Italian soldiers was tasked with helping American engineers build roads near their camp. These prisoners, some of whom had once fought the Americans just months earlier, now worked side by side with their captors. The sense of camaraderie that developed in this unusual environment was more than a shared task. It was a symbol of the deep transformation that was unfolding. The psychological impact was profound, and the realization that they were being offered the possibility of a new life was a turning point that many of the prisoners would never forget. The emotional weight of years spent in combat, of witnessing death and destruction, was slowly being replaced by the hope that they could rebuild, not just their countries, but their own lives. Some Italian POWs, particularly those who had lost everything during the war, began to reflect on the futility of the conflict. For them, the war was a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of the American camps, the kindness of their captors, and the quiet thought that perhaps they could start anew. In those moments of peace, the Italian soldiers, once hardened by the brutality of war, were reborn not as enemies, but as human beings who had survived. As World War II came to an end in 1945, the Italian prisoners of war, once mere pawns in a global conflict, were now left to navigate a new life, one that was no longer defined by war but by survival and reintegration into a post-conflict world. For the American soldiers, the task of releasing and repatriating the POWs was as significant as their role in defeating the Axis forces. By the time the war had officially ended, many Italian POWs had spent months, even years, in American captivity. The camps in the United States, where most Italian soldiers had been held, had provided not just basic necessities, but also a measure of hope, a glimmer of peace after years of fear and uncertainty. However, the journey from captivity to freedom was not an easy one. For some, the prospect of returning to Italy, a nation ravaged by war, with its infrastructure shattered and its people weary, was met with mixed emotions. Italy had surrendered to the Allies, but it was still struggling to recover from the devastation that had engulfed it. The country had lost thousands of young men, many of them soldiers who would never return home. Many of the POWs had left their families years ago and were unsure of what they would find upon their return. For others, the idea of returning to Italy was daunting, particularly as many had now lived for several years in the United States, where they had been treated with relative kindness. Some, having experienced the American way of life, were reluctant to leave. The idea of starting anew in a foreign land, where they had the opportunity to work and contribute, was an appealing one. With the help of American authorities, some POWs were even given the chance to stay in the U.S. After their release, many of the Italian prisoners were put to work in vital post-war industries, particularly in agriculture and construction. The United States, which was still recovering from the war itself, needed workers to help rebuild the economy, and the POWs were an invaluable resource. For some, This work led to permanent residence in the U.S. after the war. They settled in rural areas, often working on farms where their labor helped rebuild both the land and their own lives. For those who chose to return to Italy, their reintegration into society was far from easy. Italy, having been torn apart by years of war, was in the midst of rebuilding. The political landscape had shifted dramatically, and many of the soldiers who returned home had to navigate a changing world. The experience of captivity, though a reprieve from the brutality of war, had left deep scars. Some men struggled with their identity, caught between the country they had once fought for and the reality of their new lives. For those who remained in the United States, the story was different. Many Italian POWs eventually became citizens, contributing to the growth of the American workforce in the post-war boom. Their lives were forever marked by their time in captivity, but for them, the future held promise. They had been given a second chance, and they seized it. The impact of the treatment of Italian POWs during their time in American hands extended far beyond their immediate release and reintegration. It not only influenced the lives of the soldiers themselves, but also left a lasting mark on post-war relations between the United States and Italy, as well as shaping broader international policies on the treatment of prisoners of war. One of the most significant long-term effects was the change in the relationship between Italy and the United States. Prior to the war, Italy had been an ally of Nazi Germany, and the two nations had formed a pact that extended their reach across Europe and North Africa. Yet, by 1943, Italy was fighting a losing battle, and its military was in disarray. When the country surrendered to the Allies, many Italians found themselves at odds with their own government, caught between the forces of fascism and the hope of survival. Their treatment by the Americans, who had captured thousands of Italian soldiers, would become a critical moment in reshaping Italy's post-war identity. During their time as prisoners, the Italians were not only treated with dignity, but also allowed the opportunity to work, build relationships, and experience a kind of humanity that had been missing from the war. For the Italian soldiers, particularly those who were in American camps, the process of returning home wasn't just about survival, it was about changing perceptions. The American treatment of Italian POWs was a stark contrast to the brutalities many had faced under the Axis powers. It was a kindness that would reverberate for years, changing how these soldiers would view their captors. In the years after the war, this shift in perception would foster stronger ties between Italy and the U.S., helping to build a partnership that would play a pivotal role in the reconstruction of Europe. For the Italians who remained in the United States, their experiences of captivity became part of the fabric of the Italian-American immigrant experience. Many of these men became part of the broader wave of Italian immigration to the U.S. in the post-war years. They worked in agriculture, construction, and factories, helping to fuel the economic boom of the 1950 seconds. Their integration into American society was marked by their hard work and their willingness to contribute to a new life in a country that had once been their enemy. Over time, their stories of survival, of compassion, and of the ultimate kindness extended to them by their American captors became part of the larger narrative of Italian-American identity. The impact of the U.S. policy on POW treatment also set a precedent for how prisoners were to be handled in future conflicts. In the decades following World War II, international laws surrounding the treatment of POWs would be further refined, influenced by the standards set by the Allies during the war. The Geneva Conventions, which had laid out the legal protections for prisoners, were reinforced in the post-war period, and the United States' example of humane treatment contributed to the broader international discourse on human rights. Perhaps the most profound long-term effect, however, was the personal legacy carried by the former Italian POWs. Many of them, despite the trauma of war, went on to live lives of dignity and hope. Some built families in the United States, while others returned to a recovering Italy. The experience of being treated with respect and compassion by their American captors not only changed their lives, but also redefined their perceptions of the world around them. It was a powerful reminder that, even in the darkest days of war, there was the possibility of humanity, of kindness, of understanding, and of the belief that all men, no matter their nationality or their past, deserve the chance to rebuild. The story of the Italian prisoners of war who were taken to America during World War II is not just a tale of military strategy or international diplomacy. It is a deeply human story, one that speaks to the power of compassion and the capacity for change in even the most brutal of times. In the context of a world torn apart by war, this moment, the moment when these men realized they were safe in the hands of their captors, represents the fragile line between survival and despair, between cruelty and kindness. For the Italian soldiers, the war had been a long and painful journey. They had fought not for ideals or beliefs, but out of duty and circumstance. They were soldiers of a regime that had promised glory, but had instead led them into ruin. Many of them had joined the military in their youth, eager to defend their homeland, only to find themselves thrust into the horrors of war. As prisoners, they were caught between enemy forces, struggling to understand their own identities and their place in a world turned upside down. But in the American camps, they found something unexpected. They found not just food, water, and shelter, but also a form of humanity that transcended the battlefield. The kindness of their captors, the respect shown to them, was a powerful reminder that, even in the darkest hours of conflict, the human spirit could still find a way to rise above the ashes. For the Italians, this shift in their treatment marked the end of one chapter, that of enemies and soldiers, and the beginning of another. It was the beginning of healing, of survival, and of a new sense of hope. In the broader scope of history, this story speaks to something even larger: the ability of people to change, to see one another not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. It was in the American treatment of these POWs that a critical lesson of the war emerged, that victory is not simply about defeating your enemies, but about understanding them, offering them dignity in their defeat, and giving them a chance to rebuild. It is a lesson that has shaped the post-war world and continues to resonate today. The experience of these Italian prisoners, their moments of despair and their eventual relief, reminds us that even in times of global conflict, we are all connected by our shared humanity. The kindness extended to them by their American captors stands as a testament to the idea that, even in the most dire of situations, there is always the potential for a moment of grace. As the world emerged from the wreckage of war, the story of these prisoners was just one among millions. Yet it remains one of the most poignant examples of the power of compassion and understanding in the face of adversity. It is a reminder that, even in the shadow of war, humanity can find a way to heal.